The African Development Bank's 52nd annual meetings was held in Gujarat, India in May 2017. The event was well attended by the bank's governors, who are the finance, trade or economic development ministers from its 54 regional and 26 non-regional member countries, as well as many stakeholders. About 3,000 delegates and participants from all over the world came together to debate key issues facing Africa's development. The performance of the bank with regards to delivering on its mandate and plans for the future, the closest on the map being the year 2018. The African Development Bank has a mandate to accelerate sustainable economic development and social progress in each of its regional member countries, thereby contributing to the reduction of poverty. Within the next hour, you will be watching highlights of the bank's activities geared towards demonstrating its calling to take Africa on a pathway out of poverty. Hello and welcome. I am Christy.
I'm delighted to be here today to celebrate with the African Development Bank the commissioning of its Nigeria country office complex.
This indeed is a major milestone in the evolution of the AfDB, and I congratulate you. Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this day stands as a testimony to the reality of a much cherished and long-held aspiration, and indeed a very important event in the partnership between Nigeria and the African Development Bank.
From the launch of the AfDB's state-of-the-art Nigeria complex in the country's capital, Abuja, to the release of its annual flagship report, the African Economic Outlook 2018, the bank's activities, all geared towards driving what it calls the high fives, have received positive reviews. The AfDB's high five focus on lighting up, powering, feeding, industrializing, integrating, and improving the quality of life in Africa. The latest round of accolades for the AfDB comes on the back of its launch of the historical Nigerian office.
Our investments are structured around high five priorities: light up and power Africa, feed Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. We've invested $500 million in the Development Bank of Nigeria. We expanded private equity investment in agriculture, and it's good to see the Minister of Agriculture who succeeded me here. We put in $18 million into the Fund for Financing Agriculture in Nigeria. This year, we will also be investing $200 million in the Transmission Company of Nigeria to support the rehabilitation of existing transmission lines in partnership with the World Bank. We've invested $100 million in the mainstream power IPP in Jeba and Kainji to add 700 megawatts to the national grid. Thank you. Our private sector investment includes $300 million in Dangote Industries to promote refining of petroleum products, and $100 million to support Fertilizer Company as part of a $1.2 billion syndicated loan that will provide Nigeria with the capacity to produce 1.4 million metric tons of fertilizers and expected to generate $2.1 billion in export earnings over the project life cycle. We've also invested an additional $134 million in Olam in agriculture. We are providing $263 million towards the rehabilitation of basic livelihoods in the northeast of Nigeria, with the expectation of providing water, sanitation, hygiene, and health services that will impact 14 million people, including 1.9 million internally displaced people. Our support of $85 million to the Lekki Concession Company helped construct 50 kilometers of Lekki-Ekpe Expressway. This was the first public-private infrastructure partnership in Nigeria, and we look forward to supporting more in infrastructure in Nigeria. Our support extends to the financial sector, and I see so many of the CEOs of the banks here today. Several Nigerian banks have benefited from $1.8 billion in lines of credit, including Access Bank, Fidelity Bank, Stanbic IBTC Bank, the First Bank, Wema Bank, the Zenith Bank, the GT Bank, the Bank of Industry, the Bank of Agriculture, and also Nexim, among others. Your Excellency, Mr. Vice President, this edifice further beautifies our enormous investments in Nigeria and is very befitting for Nigeria. As you have noticed, the building's color is green. Green means prosperity. It is indeed my prayer that Nigeria itself will prosper and that the African Development Bank will be there always as a strategic partner in Nigeria's prosperity. Nigeria's prosperity is always shared with other African countries. Nigeria's establishment of the $500 million Nigerian Trust Fund at the African Development Bank has supported so many African countries and remains a key part of the African Development Bank group. Nigeria's share capital at the bank will continue to be crucial as we look forward towards a general capital increase for the bank. We look to Nigeria's strong support. This building makes a bold statement, specifically that the African Development Bank is here to stay in Nigeria. It sends a very strong message that the African Development Bank appreciates Nigeria. And it sends a message that Nigeria's place in the integration of Africa, especially in West Africa, cannot be ignored. And we cannot ignore the fact that Africa's largest economy is now out of recession and projected to grow at 2.3% this year.
First stop at the launch is the AfDB's presser to give stakeholders insight into why the Development Bank's first ever permanent office is located in Nigeria, outside its Côte d'Ivoire base.
The board has decided that clearly Nigeria, by any metrics in this continent, Nigeria is the largest, right? So it absolutely makes sense to show that commitment in your shareholder, largest shareholder, but also a country where you have so much operations going on. There's value for money in having that kind of decision made. It's significant also because when the board made that decision in 2009, the idea was that you start with a prototype. So this is the prototype. It's the first building that we have done. But as we do the same things in the other regions, this will be the model that I think will be rolled out in the other areas as well.
In an exclusive with CNBC Africa, Fall Ebrima says the new office is crucial to its regional integration and will enhance the AfDB's relations to Africa.
The building actually goes back to about 2009. The bank started a decentralization program in which the bank made a decision to move closely or closer to its clients. So that process started out with a few countries, Nigeria being one of them. And we started out in Lagos at the time in 1971 with 5 staff members, a very small office, very small operations, less than 5 million, I think at the time was the lending that we had, in the country. But over time, clearly, the significance of Nigeria as the #1 economy in the continent, the most populous also, and also the most politically influential country. But more importantly for us, Nigeria is the largest shareholder of the African Development Bank. That's critically important. And critically important also, Nigeria provides a third window, lending window for the bank. Nigeria, our program at the moment in Nigeria ranges between 5.5 billion to 6 billion a year. The total portfolio. An annual program ranging anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion a year. So that's a large portfolio. The Nigeria active portfolio alone is larger than the bank's portfolio in most of the regions, if you take the average of the region. So that's a large engagement. And I think while the decision was made to choose Nigeria, it also now coincides with the fact that it is the most important in terms of portfolio, of course, together with South Africa and some of the North African countries. This particular building is also crucial in terms of the regional integration agenda of the bank. As you know, our charter enshrines regional integration in there. Together, the bank, together with Nigeria and ECOWAS, I think will really move the regional integration agenda forward. We already are doing a lot in that space, but we know that more can be done, and I think this office is also going to be quite instrumental in pushing that agenda forward. The Nigeria Trust Fund was established in 1976 by the Nigerian government. At the time, it was around the time that oil prices were beginning to really escalate quite a bit, and Nigeria was making quite a bit of rent from that. Nigeria recognized the hardships that other African countries were going through because of the higher oil prices at the time, and also the difficulties of having development spending in those countries. So Nigeria established a trust fund that is still managed by the bank to assist those countries, both in terms of their own individual development programs, but also as a region, to see what regional projects can be supported through the Nigeria Trust Fund. That fund has now grown to over 500 million, and it has implemented hundreds of projects across the continent. So it's a very important window of the bank. Yeah. Associated with the Nigerian Trust Fund is what we call the Nigeria Technical Capacity Fund. And that fund, as the name implies, also it's a smaller fund of 25 million, but it supports capacity building in the member countries of the African Development Bank. So yes, Nigeria is is taking quite a leadership role in terms of the African Development Bank.
Okay, so now let's look now at the project pipelines we have in Nigeria. You know how the bank has been cooperating with Nigeria. So can you speak to the project in the pipeline over the years and what we're expecting to see going forward?
The current active portfolio of Nigeria is about $5.5 billion. And it's divided almost 50-50 between lending to the public sector and lending to the private sector. In the public sector, of course, we've supported the usual infrastructure projects, roads, agriculture, human development, capital development, education, etc. Whereas in the private sector, we have been able to support, through lines of credits mostly, lending to SMEs. As you know, most of the jobs that have been created through the SME window. So we provided a lot of lines of credits to many banks in Nigeria to on-lend now to the SMEs. That has been one large activity. In the private sector also, we have supported some very important life-changing projects. One that comes to mind is the Lekki Toll Road. You know, I think that before the Lekki Toll Road was built, people had to wake up around 4 o'clock, you know, to try to get to the center in Lagos. We think it's an important project that has actually changed lives, because I think people can now go to work much later and then get home also much earlier than they could have without the toll road. There's also the Interim Fertilizer project, which was also financed by the bank. And in fact, that has been so successful that we are now considering this year a second loan to Interim to expand their fertilizer operations to the rest of the African continent.
Segun Ladiga designed the building. He says a number of factors such as climate change and intimacy were considered in putting up a circular hut-inspired structure. It is supported by 53 pillars representing the bank's 53 member countries at the time of the design. South Sudan became its 54th member after the design was completed.
Oh yes, how we came up with the design and the concept, there were a number of factors that were put together. One were the local building regulations, which played quite a significant part in what we did here. It's a very large site, and the regulations in the city here require a minimum footprint size and a minimum building height. However, the client also required a particular floor area of usable space. So what we chose to do was to do a building with an atrium. First, the atrium enables us to have a large communal space in the center of the building, which could be used for all kinds of activities, get-together activities, breakout space, and exhibition space. So it becomes a utility, a social space in the middle of the office building. The atrium, secondly, of course, means that you have a big cylinder with a hollow in the middle. We're able to fulfill the footprints. We're able to also make a very useful space in the center of the building. Atrium also acts as a shaft to move air through the building. So you have a large space that is naturally ventilated, but practically like it's trapped in between. Now, this again means that we are able to reduce the energy demand in the building significantly, because the amount of air conditioning you need to be comfortable in this building is almost like 40% less than you would have in a building of same dimensions, designed conventionally. So that's one critical point about it. Secondly, was to create an intimate, friendly office space that promotes, you see, the whole idea is to promote interaction, create a space that makes for at times spontaneous engagement between people in the course of using the building. Externally, we've also designed a building that has some typical African feel to it. In terms of first, the shape, the circular huts is very, very pervasive all over the African landscape as traditional buildings. It's also a very efficient form in terms of heat transmission into the building. A circular building takes in very little heat because you have just a small face of the building at any time open to direct heat, maximum heat exposure. We've then gone further to use high performance glass. This is high performance glass. This cuts heat transmission again by a further 75%, in addition to the fact that the building itself is naturally shaded in terms of the shape.
A 5-story building built on a footprint of 1,500 square meters. The entire plot is of 7,600 square meters. And this building is able to have a workstation of about 250 staff, inclusive of the meeting room and also the other facilities. This building is equipped of access control, smart access control view card. So any staff based here can use his card to enter. Even staff on mission can use it. We have video surveillance, more than 64 cameras surrounding the building to check. We have also building automation solution, and we have what is very new here is the electrical car chargers that we have provided at the parking lots. Design itself first is a low consumption building because of the big atrium, and also we can say we have two envelopes, which means that the heat cannot come easily in. So we can make the power consumption very less for the cooling of the building. That's come from the structural design. Secondly, we have a building automation system that is helping for the operating of the building. So this can help for power consumption, less power consumption. And when you visit an office, you will see the light will come on when you enter. When you go out, it will stop, which means you don't need to give more instruction to staff to stop and off, put the power on and stop it when we are leaving. It goes automatically.
So it's a very special event today for the ADB. This is the first regional office that they've opened in their, I believe, 54-year history or something. It's been in the works for quite a long time. So, you know, it's quite a special event. And for all of us that deal with the ADB, it's good that they have an office here that we can now deal with. DFIs are extremely important. So they're a very significant source of funding. But more important than that, actually, they're also a very significant source of knowledge and best practice. So it's one thing to bring funding into a country or project, but you want to make sure that that project has the best chance possible of succeeding and also of having the impact that it's supposed to have. And DFIs spend a lot of time and effort not only preparing the projects to give them the best chance of succeeding, but actually also monitoring and evaluating projects afterwards to learn lessons so that they can improve what they do going forward. So I think they're extremely valuable, and you know, this is a very important day for Nigeria.
Nigeria is the AfDB's largest shareholder with an estimated portfolio of $6 billion. The country's finance minister, Kemi Adeosun, has made a formal request to host the African Development Bank's regional hub in Nigeria.
Indeed, I think it is time to accord Dr. Adesina what the AfDB are known for, a high five for his dynamic and responsive leadership at the AfDB. And it has ushered in so many landmark achievements, of which this building is just one. This new office complex will no doubt strengthen Nigeria's effort and our desire for regional integration in the West African region. It is in this regard that I'd like to put on record Nigeria's strong desire and, if you may permit me, our demand to host the regional hub for West Africa here in Nigeria. We think that as the largest shareholder in the AfDB since inception, and the country with one of the largest portfolios, and also the largest economy in Africa, we deserve to be the regional hub for the AfDB, and therefore want to lend our voice to that sentiment that we would like you, Mr. President, to please convey this official and formal request to the senior management and to the executive board of the AfDB that Nigeria wishes to be the regional hub.
Since its founding in 1964, the African Development Bank has evolved into one of the most efficient vehicles for the economic development and integration of the African continent. The bank has faithfully played its role as a trusted advisor and an honest broker in our region, and has also earned its place as the voice of Africa on development issues. As the continent's premier financial institution, it is at the center of Africa's transformation to bring real and lasting progress to the lives of African people. While Africa has made significant strides in economic growth and in poverty reduction, much remains to be done. The goal is clear: to eradicate poverty, to create more inclusive socio-economic development, and to integrate the continent. To do so, the continent needs to promote growth that creates jobs and provides economic opportunities for all. To contribute to this agenda, the African Development Bank, through the high fives unveiled by Dr. Adesina when he took office in 2015, is, in our view, right on track, especially by investing more in infrastructure, especially power and water, agriculture, education, healthcare, and increased access, in particular, to affordable energy and water. More importantly, the bank is to be commended for its ongoing efforts to close the gender gap, empower women and youths, and to ultimately strengthen and expand social safety nets for our most vulnerable populations.
One of the activities leading up to the commissioning of the landmark building was the AfDB's Junior Art Contest, tagged "Farming is Cool." It was to promote agriculture's potential to Nigeria's secondary school children and inspire a generational shift in the sector. The announcement of the month-long competition's winners was one of the highlights of the ceremony. All three winners received partial scholarships of 1 million naira, 500,000 naira, and 250,000 naira.
Just like we all know, farming is a cool business, and if you check it, the youths of nowadays, they don't like participating in farming activities, thinking maybe it's only for those that are old. But the main thing is that farming is a nice business. When you participate into it, most especially fish farming, it's a very nice business, and also another way of getting income. When I saw the team, farming is cool, I remember back then when me and my mom would go to the farm, do one or two things. So I said, okay, let me just depict it in my painting. First, to sponsor myself in school, and also to get one or two art materials, and to also help my parents because they are farmers.
Farming is just, it's cool in the sense that when you sell, you gain. When you gain, you get money to pay your bills around, then you live a comfortable life. Just advise people that are into farming to continue what they are doing because it's a very nice thing.
For the AfDB, the plan is to make agriculture inclusive across Africa. In an exclusive interview with CNBC Africa, Director of Human Capital, Youth and Skills Development of the AfDB, Ole Dibawada, gave details of the African Leaders for Nutrition initiative, as well as efforts required to harness Africa's human capital for growth.
That in the African continent, I don't think poverty should be an excuse. We are all, a majority of the Africans are farmers. So we grow. We have organic food. But we use them. Sometimes we use part of it for consumption. The others we use to sell them. So I think what is important is to educate the poor people on the importance of having a balanced diet. You can have mangoes. I mean, kids eat mangoes. We grow rice. We have cassava. So what is important is to educate them to be able to ensure that they have a balanced diet, that it doesn't just focus on one area or one particular nutrient, but to really spread it across. I don't think it's poverty per se. I think it's an awareness of how do we balance what we have, because a lot of what we have, most of it is free. It's grown, homegrown. We are rich. We have rich soils, and it's homegrown. So I think what we need to do is to educate and create that awareness, and to also get the governments to ensure that they put in place policies that support really understanding the dynamics of nutrition and having nutritious food. Another area that I think our governments need to look at is ensuring that there are policies, particularly within the markets, on what is being sold for consumption. I think that is very, very fundamental, because we keep eating what we don't understand, what we don't know how it is manufactured, and I think it's important that we really look at all of those holistically. I think the first start will be political will to make sure that we put nutrition at the heart of what we do, And the second part is also educating the policymakers. It starts going down to different levels. So from the heads of state to the ministries, to the actors, to the civil society organization, sensitization. So those are the key steps that we will take. But at our level here, what we felt was fundamental was to bring together the leaders first, because that's where the buck stops. They are the ones that can make or break this initiative, and to get them to really engage and to commit to it. Unfortunately, 90% of them are all converted and are committed, but I think it's a way of really supporting them. What we are doing in the bank now is to really look at capacity building of nutrition across the entire bank. So all the sectors that we have in the African Development Bank will ensure that we are mainstreaming nutrition. So when we are building initiatives on water and sanitation, on agriculture, on gender issues, on education, we make sure that nutrition is mainstreamed across all the different areas. So that's one key start that we're doing. The African Development Bank has also set up the African Leaders for Nutrition Secretariat that is being funded and supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the Secretariat is now on course, and we hope that with this team that we have, we will be able to work and looking at banking on nutrition, where we are mainstreaming nutrition across the bank, and then looking at how we support the champions to build capacity to ensure nutrition at the country level. So we're looking at it in two folds.
Just as it began, a timeout with the media marked the end of the commissioning ceremony. The final decision to build the AfDB's first permanent office in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, follows the bank's board of directors' approval and recommendation for an office in Nigeria. The construction, which started in January 2016, took 16 months to complete. The plan is to replicate the 220 staff capacity 4-story building across member countries of the AfDB. After the break, we'll take a look at the bank's projections for the African continent in its recently launched African Economic Outlook 2018. AfDB launched the 2018 edition of its yearly flagship report, the African Economic Outlook, in January this year at its headquarters in Abidjan. As a leading African institution, the Development Bank was the first to provide headline numbers on Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook. According to the president of the AfDB Group, Akinwumi Adesina, Africa ought to grow at a double-digit rate. He also says industrialization must be matched with a desire to grow agriculture if Africa must move up the value chain of the world economy.
Over 70% of Africa's poor are in the rural areas. So as we talk about industrialization, we've got to understand that unless that industrialization takes into consideration that 70% of the population locked in poverty, structural poverty in our rural areas, we will not succeed. And therefore, agriculture must be at the forefront of what we do with this industrialization.
The Development Bank's key stakeholders say Africa's growth prospects for this year are better than those of the previous years.
Because it's actually the first time in the history of the African Development Bank that we are launching our flagship economic report here in Abuja, in our home country. It's also the first since this report was initiated in the early 2000s. It's the first which has been really done mainly in-house. As some of you may know, it was done for many years with various partners.
In the past, of course, Africa had grown at about roughly 5% in terms of growth rates. But I must tell you that Africa's economies dipped because of the global commodity prices that went down, and the shocks and the impact of that on current account deficit of many countries, the impact of that on the currency of many countries. The exchange rate was affected, inflation went up in many, many countries. But it's not unique to Africa. It affected everybody else. What I'm trying to say is the importance of keeping your head above water. It's what they always tell you when you're swimming. And in an environment in which the global economy was actually growing at a rate that's actually, we are growing at a higher level of growth than the global economy. And yes, that growth also has been quite low, of course. It's roughly about 3%. But I'm sure, as the economist has told you, in 2017, Africa's growth rate will be 3.6%. It was 3.6%. It's going to go to 4.1% in 2018 and 2019. So which means Africa is managed to keep its head above water. And I think if your head is above water, you're doing well. The key message there is that African economies are actually quite resilient in an environment where you have so much global shocks as you have today. The other thing that I want to say is that we have an unfinished business in terms of the structural transformation of Africa's economies themselves. I just came back from Liberia just yesterday night. And as it's the same as I look all across Africa, what I see that the bulk of our population are stuck at the bottom. That's where we have a lot of the poverty. And so even if we talk about growth rates, African economies, in my view, still needs to grow at double-digit rate if we are going to have a big impact on driving poverty down.
We do have a gap in infrastructure funding to the tune of about $150 to $180 billion a year. With Africa's population approaching 2 billion by 2050, there is much work that needs to be done. We need to prepare for a future that is essentially already upon us. We need massive investments in infrastructure. Why? We have a responsibility to begin to build on the foundations that we currently have to provide smart technologies that will create smart cities and ultimately smart nations.
In an exclusive interview with CNBC Africa's Executive Director, West Africa, Frederick van der Vyver, Abebe Shimeles spoke about Africa's growth prospects in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and other key factors highlighted in the AEO report.
The African Economic Outlook 2018 we just released reports that in 2017, Africa grew at 3.2%, and we expect next year and 2019, the continent's average GDP growth will be 4.1%. So this is much better than 2016 and even 2015, when the commodity price collapse led to slow growth in many parts of the continent. But we believe this resilience of African economies, despite small recovery in commodity prices, indicates there has been much more factors than commodity prices explaining this recovery and growth resilience.
And among this increase in terms of economic growth, which are the countries that are leading the march?
This year, among the 10 top fast-growing African economies, you will find, of course, in the East Africa, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. But a bunch of them are in West Africa: Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. This year, actually, West African countries seem to be leading the pack among the 10 fast growing African countries.
And among those countries, if you have to pick one, what were the reasons for the growth?
Yes, I mean, if I pick Côte d'Ivoire, where we are, it is for the last 3 or 4 years, the economy has been really growing fast. Partly it is investment, public investment in infrastructure. Partly it's also the recovery of the cocoa sector, but also improving services. The country's banking sector is now booming, and the hotels, etc. New hotels are being introduced. Construction is employing a large number of people. So there is a lot of optimism in the Ivorian economy.
Obviously, there are still a lot of key challenges in terms of infrastructure, like electricity, transport, etc. Or are the progresses have been made in the past year?
Yes, in Africa, I think we have heard the president mentioning Africa's resilience and economic performance has been unprecedented since the last 2 decades. However, the most important is this is just the beginning for this continent. Because it is coming from a very long-drawn economic collapse in the 70s, 80s, 90s. The capital stock, which I talked about in the presentation, for Africa has been completely lost during those periods, and it has been growing very slowly, even as we speak. So as a result, the complex and perhaps most difficult part of Africa's challenge now, which I agree with the president, is to record double-digit growth. Otherwise, all the sustainable development goals that has been set, fast reduction in poverty, and generating jobs for the 12 million young people who join the labor force every year becomes very difficult. So to rise up to that challenge, technology and industrialization becomes important, which takes you back to developing skills. Our higher education, vocational education, and those that equip the young people with the know-how to operate and understand the technology that is evolving becomes important. And I want to add to that also, what the president mentioned about artificial intelligence. It's very much worrying. In the next few decades, if you go to a restaurant and you are served by a robot, the potential for low-skilled labor to be employed globally becomes a very serious issue. So that is where I think African leaders must take a hard look at where they want to go and how to accelerate, speed up, and raise the level of growth that is also inclusive.
Before we wrap, let's now take you back to Davos, the World Economic Forum 2018, where, in an exclusive interview with CNBC Africa's editor-at-large, Browen Nelson, the AfDB president, Akinwumi Adesina, spoke about the AfDB's mission to boost industrialization of agriculture. He also made a case for investments on the continent.
Well, first and foremost, I think the fact that Africa's economy is actually running back is very good news, because remember that African economies went down. We've grown for 5% for quite a long time, but it went to 2.2% in 2016. So we're back to 3.6% last year, and now this year we're going to 4.1%, and we project that we'll rise to 4.2% or even higher by next year. I think the key things to keep in mind is that why this is happening. It's happening because the global economic environment is improving, and secondly, because the commodity prices have recovered to a great part, and also because of domestic demand. There's a lot of rising domestic demand for import substitution across African economies, and a lot of countries, agriculture is actually doing well. So this is actually quite good. But however, I don't believe that 4.1% is what we need to drive down poverty on the continent. I think the continent needs to grow at double-digit GDP growth rates, because the amount of poverty we have is still very, very high. And so people don't eat GDP, of course, so you've got to make sure that things have impact on the lives of people. So I do think that where the focus should be is, how do we get growth that is inclusive, growth that would take hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and how do we make sure that we reduce the level of inequality that we actually have, because Africa today is still the second in terms of income inequality in the world. And we have a lot of fragility, of course, because a lot of people are left behind, in particular the young people. And so I have said, with the population of young people that we have today, of well over 320 million people, that means that the African Development Bank, my #1 constituency right now, is actually the youth, because we have to create a lot of jobs for them. It makes no sense to me, and it breaks my heart to see young people fall off, desperate for life and gasping for air in the Mediterranean Sea. That's not the future Africa needs, and that's why we've got to make sure that we push for structural transformation of Africa's economy, drive a lot of investments in, but make sure whatever we do, we take the hundreds of millions of our people out of poverty and create massive amount of jobs for our youth.
Now, the economic report also refers to the infrastructure funding gap, which has increased to between 130 and 170 billion US dollars. How are we going to capture the funding needed to create, as you say, the right infrastructure for inclusive growth?
First and foremost, we used to say that the amount of infrastructure gap in Africa was roughly $50 to $60 billion a year. But that was because we were just talking more generally. The high fives that we launched at the African Development Bank to make sure that Africa has universal access to electricity, and also that we transform agriculture completely and make Africa totally self-sufficient in food and become a very competitive exporter of food, means that the infrastructure for that also has to change. We released our Africa Economic Outlook report last week. And what we said was that the amount of infrastructure financing needed is anything between $100 to $170 billion a year. But that leaves you a gap of anything between $68 to $108 billion. And so the question is, how are we going to make sure that we close that gap? First is that I think that Africa should look inside. I think Africa has a lot of resources. Africa may have a lot of poor people, but Africa is not a poor continent by any chance at all. We have massive amount of funds that are available in terms of the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, and also the institutional investors. If you take a look at all of that together, in 2012 alone, it was roughly about $670 billion. But by 2020, that's going to go to roughly $1.9 trillion. So which means that what we've got to do is, how do we tap that and make sure that it go into investment in critically needed infrastructure? And what the African Development Bank is doing is, actually we're launching a new forum that is called the Africa Investment Forum. And the key to that is we want the global pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds and other institutional investors to come to Africa, because that's where the infrastructure needs, and that's where the rate of return is actually much higher. And so what we are doing that's going to be very different. The forum is going to be in South Africa, and you would be excited to hear that.
Did I hear you correctly? South Africa, sir? And would you like to do the honors and tell us where exactly in South Africa and when?
It is going to be in South Africa, in Johannesburg, from the 7th to the 8th of November. It's created a lot of buzz right here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And what's going to be unique about it, it's not just that we want to set up another forum just to talk. In fact, the uniqueness of this Africa Investment Forum is that the only conversation you will have, the only speeches that will be made, is just investment, investment, investment. We're going to bring all the global investors together with the project developers. And then the African Development Bank, working with the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, Inter-American Development Bank, and many others, will create a mutualized risk-sharing facility to de-risk projects at scale and make sure that things happen. And it's going to be a forum where, I'm sorry, the heads of state won't have a chance to actually give speeches, but I'm sure they'll be happy when investments show up in their countries.
So less protocol, more investment, may I say. Yes. Just looking at the broader picture for the African Development Bank, one of the areas that you are passionate about is agric industrialization. How is that agenda going for the African continent?
It's going very well. The thing is, coming back to the issue of infrastructure that we just talked about here, infrastructure is very expensive. So the key is how you invest in infrastructure, where you invest in infrastructure. And you want to invest in infrastructure in a way that it can help you to unlock new sources of growth. And those new sources of growth have to be in areas that can lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. That's what we have to do. And that's why at the African Development Bank, we are pushing now for the establishment of what we call staple crop processing zones. Now, these are vast areas in rural economy, in the rural areas, where the African Development Bank, once and others, will invest in critical infrastructure, power, water, roads, and ICT infrastructure. Then we will work with the governments, the ministers of finance, to provide fiscal incentives for the food and agribusinesses in Africa to be located within those zones in the rural economy. Just think about what that does. That's going to create massive amount of markets for all the agricultural produce in Africa. It's going to make sure that we are not losing what we are producing, because we're losing over 70% of what we produce. It will also create massive amount of jobs for young people. It will make agriculture cool and sexy, and the rural economy will change from zones of, economic misery to zones of economic prosperity. So it's a new way of actually creating new growth centers for Africa that will allow us to pull a lot of people up. So, the African Development Bank in the agriculture sector, we're going to be putting in $24 billion into that sector over the next 10 years. I firmly believe that, Africa needs to become a global powerhouse in food and agriculture, and that has to come by agricultural industrialization. So that's the kind of industrialization that we need, one that would turn around our rural economy and create hope for millions and millions of people.
Well, it's your execution in that space that led to you receiving the World Food Prize earlier this year, or earlier last year. I'm getting confused with 2017 and 2018. Also on the stage in 2016, you launched the New Deal on energy for Africa. How is that going? Are you again finding the support and the momentum behind you, sir?
Absolutely. The first priority that I set at African Development Bank is to light up and power Africa. You were here at the World Economic Forum when we actually launched. A lot has happened, significant since that time. First, if you take a look at the African Development Bank last year, we did 1.4 gigawatts of financing. That is 1,400 megawatts that we supported last year in electricity. We have been able last year to do well over 22,000 kilometers of transmission lines. So we're working a lot in transmission. We're working a lot also in power generation. One of the things that we're doing right now is pushing the frontiers on renewable energy. The African Development Bank today is the leader in renewable energy. I want Africa to turn its sun into power. Essentially God has been so good to us. We have so much sunshine. So all we have to do is just connect cables to them, and then we can light up Africa. And now one of our biggest ways of doing that is we've launched a $500 million fund that's called Africa Energy Inclusion Facility, which is to support the businesses, the companies that are generating power in a decentralized way. So not just the usual grid, but decentralized distributed energy. And we are, anything below 30 megawatts, it's what we're doing. And then secondly, we are launching our major effort, our largest effort yet on renewable energy, which is called Desert to Power. So if you take a look, for example, from Mali to Chad to Burkina Faso to Senegal, Mauritania, all those, another Nigeria, all those areas, you have what's called the Great Green Wall, which is this massive wall that's built just to reduce deforestation, desertification. But the problem is this. Across all those countries, access to energy is very, very low. Access to clean cooking energy in particular is almost nil. So if we don't do anything, all those areas actually, they will become the vast, just a standing wall of charcoal or firewood. And so we're trying to do what's called the Desert to Power. We want to launch massive investment in solar energy all across the entire dry belt, that area. And it will be the largest ever done in the world. We've started that work with Agence Française de Développement in France, and we've already started in Burkina Faso. And I feel tremendously excited because I think it will create a lot of jobs. I will create massive amount of local content. We can assemble the solar panels in Africa, and we will have light all across that area. And for me, it's critical to deal with insecurity with access to electricity. Guess what? Terrorists do better when there's no electricity.
For the AfDB's 53rd annual meetings, all roads lead to Busan, Korea, from the 21st to the 25th of May 2018.
We are currently reviewing and developing our developed agenda. So I think that the next coffee meeting will be a good opportunity for enhancing our bilateral cooperation between Korea and Africa, and also the next annual AfDB annual meeting will be also a good opportunity for us to discuss future steps for enhancing our cooperation.
From forecasting Africa's economy and growth in its Africa Economic Outlook 2018, launching its epochal state-of-the-art Nigeria Country Department Office Complex, selling agriculture to students across Nigerian schools through painting, to making a strong statement at the World Economic Forum, the African Development Bank is definitely leaving no stone unturned in its pursuit to fulfill its mandate to contribute to the sustainable economic development and social progress of its regional members individually and, of course, jointly. And that's it on the AfDB Special Highlights. Many thanks to you for watching. I am Christy Cole.